You can also select a specific agency if you just want to look at one or two, and the same goes for agency categories. Here is the actual data itself. Again, if you just wanted to look at one agency categories like cities and towns, and you wanted to just look at 1 year, you can do that as well. All of the dashboards have these features. You can also look at the categories that I just mentioned, like requests received, and those are all listed individually as well. So this is an annual report, and we will be back next year, January 2024, to report on 2022's data. And happy to answer any questions.
And do we have any questions on Zoom? And we do. Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The dashboard's impressive. I'm wondering, do all the municipalities have a standardized link that they report that data to you on? That's neat. How do they input that data, and how difficult or not difficult is that for them?
Yes, so we have a standardized data reporting tool that LegTech helped us build. So all of the agencies that report use the exact same tool. I've been told the actual tool itself is quite easy. If you have your data together, it can take anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes to input the data itself. It's very user-friendly. We did a lot of user testing. So the tool itself is pretty easy to use. The actual collection of the data, totally different. That can vary depending on the internal things that the agencies have. So that part is separate from the actual data input, and that part's much more complicated, but the actual entry of the data, we tried to make as easy as possible.
Thank you.
Do we have additional questions? But I have a couple, so I don't want to offer time to anyone else first. Anyone else online? No. Okay. Ashley, thank you. And I also want to concur, as many people have remarked last year as well, about the Tableau databases and the dashboard being incredibly effective tools for accountability. So we appreciate the work of JLARC on this. And one of the things that struck me this year is that there was a 3-day increase in the average response time, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that that's nearly 20%, right, of increase. So it's actually quite significant. And do we have any indication of why it would take nearly 20% longer for agencies to be fulfilling public records responses?
No, that's a great question. We did notice that. I didn't notice any trends in the comments because agencies are allowed to provide comments. Those comments are available in the Excel file. We don't put them on the Tableau dashboards. Not very many agencies provide comments. There didn't seem to be any trends in comments, so we just have the actual numbers themselves.
Senator Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for this presentation. As someone who has recently been really steeped in public records, I can share that the volume is increasing dramatically of the records requests. And I find myself wondering if we shouldn't do a better job at helping the public understand how to do an effective records request. For example, I want everything from Representative Orcutt. I want his email, his phone calls, I want his text, I want his Instagram, his face, I want everything. Give it all to me. With no, not that I really want that. But if people understood that they could be more precise and laser-like in their request, but I do know of records, the records folks that I work with who just get overwhelmed with these requests that don't really appear to have much to do with anything. So they try to marshal people through and say, what is it you're looking for, and maybe I can help you. But I think in this day and age of significant government mistrust, that that people, you know, they think that there's a silver bullet waiting just for them to find it. So it might be, for my colleagues, a good path forward for us to do some education about how to be very effective in your public records request.
And I will also say that that includes those, you know, there were 26,000 requests that were open on the beginning of that January 1st. And so those are requests that could have been open for a long time. We don't actually, I don't know. But if they were closed in 2021, so say there was a request that was open for 2 years, then that whole 2-year period would be reflected in that average. So there could be requests like that that were also, you know, that were closed. And so when we're calculating that closed average, we're including requests. We asked them to count all of the days a request was open. So that includes like weekends, and it's just a running total of the numbers. So that can also influence if there's particularly long running requests that are open, that can influence that number. So there's a couple different factors that could influence it. But yes, it was a significant increase, and we did notice that trend. The median stayed the same, however. It has stayed the same since we started tracking the median. It's always been 5 days to close requests on the statewide average. So the median didn't significantly change for any of the, it was like a day or so different for the agency categories themselves.
Senator Rivers?
One more thing. So are we tracking individuals who are actively engaged in repetitively suing agencies because they feel like they've not gotten what they wanted or not gotten it on time? Do we have a figure that we attach to that?
We don't. The agencies or the Attorney General's office might, but we, JLARC, the metrics themselves don't. We do have a like legal claims metric that tracks the cost and the time that staff spent. We have those separated, but we don't have anything about specific individuals in the metrics.
Thank you, Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for those questions. One of the things, just for the public to know, that there are some resources out there for doing more effective public records requests. First and foremost, agencies are encouraged in the law to provide guidance, including consultation on how to refine your request. And many of the public records officers in the state are very good at helping people to refine their requests. The Society of Professional Journalists and the Washington Coalition for Open Government also have websites that have tips and suggestions for how to make an effective request instead of asking for all records of an agency, which actually is no longer considered a request under the law. And the last question I have has to do with the legislature's performance. You know, we're subject to this. I guess overall, it looked like to me there were about 340 agencies, before I go to the legislature, that didn't report at all, but might be above threshold. Do we know, have you had any conversation with the state auditor's office about whether or not they would include in their fiscal or other audits a report on whether, you know, because it's simple threshold. You either spent $100,000 or not, and then to report as a finding if they failed to report to JLARC. Have we had that conversation? Would you please, Kane? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm actually probably could have jumped in here too, but I'm happy to help out because I think I had the conversations more directly with the state auditor's office. We did have a dialogue with them about, is there a way that they could factor this into their audit process? They had concerns about the ability to do that across all of their audits, given the breadth and scope and the workload that would be involved. But the flip side, they've offered and provided a lot of outreach assistance, and we actually collaborated with them to develop a brochure that they have and provide to local governments, especially when they go out to do their auditing, to remind them of what the reporting requirements are. So I'm hopeful in the long term that may provide some help, even though it might not be as extensive as maybe you had thought.
Thank you. And then on legislative performance, this is our own report card. This is the 2021 data. Do you know if in 2021 the data included any claims that records were not even subject to being a public records request because of a legislative constitutional privilege that was claimed?
I would have to look back through the exceptions for denied or partially denied requests because I don't know off the top of my head. But we do have a category for that about why the legislature would have denied a request, and they have to list the reason that they deny a request. So I can definitely get that information to you.
I would be concerned that we may need a new tracker for this, because if what I've seen is denials that say we're not even citing an exemption to the Public Records Act. So that's something we might need to track entirely separately for performance of the legislature itself. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. Thank you very much, Ashley. Best wishes in your new position. We'll be seeing you in the workroom as we drop bills. So thank you very much. Next is the review of the Washington Statewide Reentry Council. And again, this is a preliminary report, and Amanda and Ashley will be presenting.
They're doing virtual.
Virtually. Okay.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much. Good morning, Chair Paulette and members of the committee. I'm Amanda Edrick, and I'm joined by my colleague, Ashley Trinnell, and we're staff to the committee. Today, we are here to present the preliminary report for a review of the Washington Statewide Reentry Council. Reentry is the transition from incarceration back into the community. The legislative auditor has concluded that the council has performed most of its statutory duties. However, without a strategic plan or measurable goals, the focus of its efforts is unclear and its impact cannot be evaluated. The legislature directed JLARC to review the council every 6 years, and this is the first review. The reviews must include the extent to which expenditures contributed toward reducing recidivism and the achievement of council objectives and benchmarks. In our presentation today, Ashley will give an overview of the council, its activities, and stakeholder involvement. Then I will discuss the Reentry Council strategic planning efforts. And now I'll turn it over to Ashley to give an overview of the council.
Thanks, Amanda. The 2016 legislature created the Statewide Reentry Council to develop collaborative and cooperative relationships with stakeholders to improve public safety and improve outcomes for people reentering the community after incarceration. The council does not operate any reentry programs. The Reentry Council is made up of 15 members. Statute requires each position on the council to represent a specific interest group, such as housing providers or public defenders, or a state agency, including the Department of Corrections or Juvenile Rehabilitation. The governor appoints members and is directed to consider the race, gender, and geographic location of appointees to reflect the Washington state incarcerated population. The Reentry Council is also supported by 2 staff members, an executive director and a coordinator. It should be noted that the executive director position became vacant at the end of 2021 and remained vacant throughout 2022 and the time of our study. Subject to Senate confirmation, the council appointed a new executive director in November, and the new executive director began earlier this week. The Department of Commerce also provides fiscal support and facilities for the council. I'll now move on to discuss the Reentry Council's activities and stakeholder engagement. The Reentry Council has performed most of its required functions. The council has held at least 4 public meetings per year as required in statute. Those meetings have been held both in person and virtually, and meetings have also been held at youth and adult prison facilities across the state. The council has issued 3 biennial reports that include policy recommendations and summarize the council's activities. The Reentry Council has also consulted with some stakeholder groups, but not all of the groups specified in statute. The council has performed additional duties allowed in statute, such as hiring the executive director and coordinator. And between fiscal years 2017 and 2022, the council spent $1.27 million, with almost $800,000 going toward the salaries and benefits for the 2 staff members and $311,000 going to nonprofit organizations through grants. Separate from the interest groups or state agencies that are represented in the membership of the council, statute requires the Reentry Council to consult 12 additional stakeholder groups. The council has had limited interaction and engagement with most of the 12 stakeholder groups, and the frequency and type of engagement varies depending on the stakeholder group. The Reentry Council has had frequent engagement with 3 stakeholders. Persons with criminal histories are frequently invited to present or share their story at council meetings and engage in discussion with council members. Reentry Council staff attend meetings held by the Department of Corrections, and the council engages with the governor's office for member appointments. After talking with stakeholders and reviewing administrative records, we saw less engagement with other stakeholder groups. For example, the Reentry Council relies on its own membership to fulfill the statutory outreach requirement to educators and jails. Council membership includes representatives from the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges and law enforcement. The Reentry Council was not able to provide evidence of working with specialty courts, managed care organizations, or behavioral health administrative service organizations. And statute requires the council to engage with all 12 of the stakeholder groups listed on the slide. Consultation with stakeholders is often done by staff or a member of the Reentry Council, but information gathered is not shared with the council as a whole. For example, staff sit in on meetings of state work groups and task forces, but staff do not provide the full council with an overview or summary of those meetings. The interactions with stakeholder groups are also not strategically planned or documented. For example, it's unclear how interactions or information gathered from stakeholders informs the council's activities or policy recommendations. Additionally, most of those interactions have not been documented. That leads to the legislative auditor's first recommendation, which is that the council should create a stakeholder engagement plan that shows how it will consistently seek input and participation from all stakeholder groups named in statute. And now I'll turn it over to Amanda to discuss the Reentry Council's strategic planning efforts.
Thanks, Ashley. The legislature expected that the JLARC's evaluation would be informed by the council's own objectives and benchmarks or performance measures. In 2016 and 2017, the Reentry Council has discussed the need for measures, but has not adopted them. Without measures, it is unclear whether the council's activities affected public safety or reentry outcomes, which is the Reentry Council's intent in statute. We also found that the Reentry Council has discussed the need to create a strategic plan, but has not done so. Without a plan, there is an unclear focus for the Reentry Council's activities. There is a list of strategic priorities in the Council's 2020 biennial report, but these priorities do not include elements suggested in best practice for strategic planning, such as identifying goals with related activities and performance measures. Also, these priorities were not adopted or discussed at a council meeting. The council has adopted a racial equity statement, but it is unclear how racial equity will inform the Reentry Council's activities like engaging stakeholders, creating policy recommendations, and issuing grants. A strategic plan begins with an entity agreeing upon a common mission and desired outcomes. An entity can then establish clear goals and to achieve those mission and outcomes. This includes adopting performance measures and benchmarks to track progress. Entities then monitor the progress and use the information collected to then inform and update the strategic plan. Best practices also state stakeholders should be involved in the strategic planning process. When the council does create a plan, we would expect to see performance measures that show progress toward a goal or outcome. Best practices call for entities to measure things like inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. The Reentry Council's inputs include staff and funding. Activities may consist of gathering stakeholders to discuss policy recommendations, and their activities should be linked to desired outcomes, such as a measurable reduction in the recidivism rate, which is an outcome identified in statute. 4 other state reentry councils measure performance, including tracking whether recommendations are implemented. The Reentry Council has made policy recommendations in its 3 biennial reports. The recommendations are on relevant reentry topics such as housing, education, employment, and legal financial obligations. However, the council generally has not linked recommendations to actions or results. For example, the council has recommended to examine and improve conditions of confinement to promote successful reentry. It is unclear exactly who needs to do what, how it should be done, or when the council would know if this recommendation was implemented. This leads us to the second legislative auditor recommendation. The council should develop a strategic plan to guide its activities, recommendations, and spending. The plan should have performance benchmarks and measures so the council can track its progress toward achieving the council's goals. Again, there are 2 legislative auditor recommendations for the Reentry Council. One is to develop a stakeholder engagement plan. The other is to develop a strategic plan with performance measures. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the legislature directed JLARC to review the council every 6 years. The next review will be in 2028. To help the council improve its work and identify performance measures for the 2028 JLARC review, the council should complete these plans. This slide has a link to our full report and other study-related materials. And this slide has the study team's contact information. And that concludes our formal remarks, and we're happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ashley and Amanda. Your review of what is a meaningful strategic plan just shows, the importance of the work we do and how applicable it is to all functions of government. Thank you for including that as part of the presentation. Are there questions for the staff? And we have with us available, I don't know if they're in person or online, Deputy Director of the Department of Commerce, Diane Klontz, Statewide Reentry Council Coordinator for Commerce, Brittany Lovely, and the Senior Research Associate for WISIP, Lauren Noth-Peterson. So if we have any questions for staff or for the agency representatives, please raise your hand. Not seeing any. And Representative Gaynor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question about the geographic diversity. Was there an effort to try and better represent the state as a whole with some of the members?
Yes, the governor does make the selection for the council members, and so the governor has to choose from whoever applies. And I know the Reentry Council there are records of the council doing outreach, trying to get more people from around the state to apply for those positions. So I would say it as, just continuing those efforts of trying to get people from around the state to apply. Maybe with being in a more hybrid environment, that would help people from around the state apply. But that's what we found there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Senator Wagner.
Yeah, so the report implies that there's a problem that we can't measure success of something that doesn't have a metric. Does the council need help with that? Do they need legislative guidance, perhaps, to help them to that end? I'm curious how we fix this, because it looks like it's a hard thing for JLARC staff to evaluate because there's no real measure of measurement.
Does the agency or council coordinator want to respond to that?
Thank you. Yes, sir. So this is Diane Clance. I'm the Deputy Director of Divisions and Program Alignment here at the Department of Commerce. And as mentioned earlier, we have been in the process for 13 months of recruiting a new executive director, and she actually started yesterday. And so we do acknowledge the need for a continued strategic plan. And part of the reason for not doing that over the last year more formally is because we really struggled to get the best person possible for the executive director. So that is top on our agenda for moving forward in the next couple of weeks in continuing to work on that strategic plan. I will also say that when the previous executive director, Christopher Poulos, who fortunately or unfortunately moved to the Department of Corrections, did give regular updates at all council meetings, and the strategic planning was noted in our biennial reports. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions on those directly at a later time. And Brittany is also here today. She's been supportive of the council for a bit of time. Brittany, anything that you'd like to add?
I think you really covered it, Diane. The question regarding metrics, I think we will see some development in that here in the next couple of months, right? Strategic planning is in the works. So we're happy to have a new executive director on board, and she is ready to hit the ground running. So
thanks, Brittany.
Senator Frame. It takes me a moment to get used to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's still representative though / senator-elect. I have not been sworn in. Thank you. This question is for Diane. I'm curious if the agency in their decision package requested sufficient funding for the agency to engage in the strategic planning process. It's not, it's usually something that requires some investment, and curious if the agency accounted for that in their decision package.
Yes, thank you for your question. So we've had numerous conversations internally and have been working with legislators on some next steps to help support the strategic planning moving forward. So we are in development conversations at this point.
Thank you, Diane.
I guess I have a follow-up question, which is, has Commerce, Corrections, or the other agencies asked for specific advice and reported back on recommendations from the council about how they are being implemented, and engaged the council and the stakeholders that the council is then supposed to be doing outreach for about those recommendations for reducing recidivism and successful reentry?
Yes, thank you for your question. So we have ongoing conversations. We've actually been meeting every other month with the council for 2022 and working on those conversations on how we should move forward with recommendations in preparation for our new executive director and for the strategic planning. As Brittany mentioned, we'll start here in the next 2 weeks. I would say also that the stakeholder engagement is unfortunately, the documentation wasn't as supportive as we would have liked it to be, but the communication with stakeholders has been very robust over the last couple years or since the inception of the Reentry Council. And we are working on different strategies on how to better demonstrate that moving forward.
Well, having looked at the report, I'm it's pleasing to hear that you're going to be being proactive in terms of engagement and follow through. But, it was brought to my attention that, for example, there was one of the stakeholder groups identified was local governments, and there are 2,500 plus local governments in the state. And there was identified, I think, 3 local governments consulted with. As former chair of the local government committee, that's pretty disconcerting. And there were interviews done by the JLARC staff with key stakeholder groups who said, there wasn't that type of regular outreach and reporting back by committee members. I mean, if our committee members not in a position or the wrong people to engage in regular, ongoing, structured communication with those stakeholder entities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So my interpretation of what happened was that the documentation wasn't robust enough. And the work with Ashley and Amanda, there's been some recommendations on how we can strengthen that moving forward. But I will also say that at each council meeting, each one of the representatives are in a position to give updates as to their stakeholder group that they represent. And, hearing that there were only 3 that were documented obviously is disheartening, because I know that the work of the council members, the previous executive director, and the work of Brittany Lovely, who, as you've seen here, has been supporting the staff for over 1.5 years. It's just not documented in that. But I would encourage folks that in our biennial reports and in our council meetings that there is conversation about what's happening from each one of those entities. So we will do better moving forward as far as the documentation goes. And in the strategic planning, we agree that we need to have a stakeholder engagement plan and a better strategic planning around measures and outcomes.
Thank you for that detailed answer. Are there any other questions or comments? Looks like we just lost our link. I would just suggest that the timing seems very opportune for a new executive director and strategic plan, and to have that incorporated as part of the response for the final report. So it's in the final report to have that work done. And I think we would be adopting the final report in May. Yes. So I think there's time to do that and encourage it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And we have already started working on our response to accompany the final report.
All right. With that, we will close out item 3 on the agenda and move to item 4, which is racial equity effects of restricted in-person education during the pandemic. And again, this is a preliminary report, and we have 3 JLARC staff members presenting. I'll ask you to introduce yourselves, and then afterwards we have available from OSPI, Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Executive Director for the Center for Improvement of Student Learning, Maria Flores, and the Assistant Superintendent for Assessment and Student Information, Deb Kame. So who is going to lead off and take it away?
All right, good morning, Chair Paulette and members of the committee. I'm Aaron Caffin, and I'm joined by my colleagues Stephanie Seto and Joshua Karras. We are staff to the committee. We are here to present the preliminary report on racial equity effects of restricting in-person education during the COVID-19 pandemic. The legislative auditor concludes that racial disparities in student assessment scores increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in higher poverty schools. OSPI does not yet have a process to monitor the effectiveness of federally funded interventions to promote learning recovery. So in March 2020, Governor Inslee issued a proclamation restricting in-person education due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Instead of in-person instruction, school districts could provide remote instruction to students. Districts began reopening school buildings in the 2020 to 21 school year in accordance with state and local public health rules. And by April 2021, all districts were required to offer some in-person instruction. In June 2021, you asked us to analyze how restrictions to in-person instruction affected educational opportunities and outcomes for students of different races and ethnicities. To do so, we analyzed available racial equity indicators, primarily using public education data from OSPI. Data was available for student enrollment, assessment scores, access to experienced teachers, student substance use, and student mental health. Data was unavailable or not comparable for other equity indicators, including attendance, graduation, course passage, and student discipline. We did not evaluate the many factors that public officials considered in the responses to the pandemic or their specific decisions about how to limit in-person instruction. So in this presentation today, we will discuss the student race and ethnicity data that we used, students' mode of instruction and enrollment, changes in assessment scores, changes in other equity indicators that we looked at, and OSPI's recovery monitoring. So first, student race and ethnicity data. Our analysis is based on federal race and ethnicity categories, which are listed here on the screen. In 2016, the legislature directed OSPI to collect more detailed student race and ethnicity data. For example, the Asian category should be broken out to include other subracial and subethnic categories, including Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, and other identities. When we began this review in 2021, OSPI had detailed student race and ethnicity data for about 17% or 18% of Washington students. And by June 2022, OSPI had that data for about 63% of students. Until OSPI completes this data collection, more detail about disparities in education for subracial and subethnic groups will not be available. Which brings us to the first legislative auditor recommendation. OSPI should finish collecting more detailed race and ethnicity data for all students in accordance with 2016 state legislation.
I will now discuss how the pandemic affected the mode in which students learned and its overall changes in enrollment. During 2020 to 21 school year, OSPI surveyed every school district about which instruction mode they were using for elementary, middle, and high schools. JLARC staff aggregated OSPI's data into three main categories: remote, in-person, and hybrid. Remote is when schools offered all instruction outside of school facilities. In-person is when schools offered all instruction within the classroom or some other school facility. And hybrid is when schools offered a combination of remote and in-person. This includes offering in-person to some grades and remote to others, or offering all students a combination of remote and in-person instruction. Our analysis found that most students during the 2020 to 21 school year were offered hybrid instruction. At the start of the school year, roughly 72% of students were located in schools and districts that offered hybrid instruction, and at the end of the school year, that grew to roughly 81%. Roughly 27% of students were offered remote instruction at the start of the school year. In April, remote instruction was fully phased out. And about 18 or 19% of students ended the school year being offered in-person instruction. As a note, students may have opted to receive a different type of instruction than what their school district offered. For example, a student may have requested to remain remote after their school switched to fully in-person. Our analysis found that students of different races and ethnicities returned to in-person instruction at different rates. By the end of the 2020 to 21 school year, roughly 24% of white students were in schools and districts that offered in-person instruction, whereas only 3% of Asian students were offered in-person instruction. We found that overall public school enrollment declined during the pandemic. Enrollment in 2019 to 20 was roughly 1.2 million students. There were, in 2020 to 21, there were roughly 1.15 million students. There was roughly a 43,000 less students in the 2020 to 21 school year. Of those 43,000 students, roughly 37,000 of them were white, which represents a 6% decline in white student enrollment, relative to the 1% decline in most other student groups. I will now discuss how assessment scores changed during the pandemic. For this study, staff analyzed student-level standardized assessment score data dating back to 2017. In Washington, students take the Smarter Balanced Assessment, which evaluates students' math and English language arts skills, and students in 3rd through 8th grade and 10th grade take this test. The test that was supposed to be administered in spring 2020 was canceled, and the spring 2021 test was postponed until fall of the next school year. Our analysis found that average math and English scores across all school levels declined from spring 2019 to spring 2022. From the assessment in spring 2019 to the one in fall 2021, average math scores decreased about 3 to 11%, and English scores decreased by 3 to 4%. On the spring 2022 assessment, math scores remained down 4 to 8% from spring 2019, and English scores remained down by roughly 2 to 5%. Our analysis found that math and English scores declined for students of all races and ethnicities. Prior to the pandemic, there were pre-existing disparities in math scores. Average assessment scores declined for all racial and ethnic groups. From 2019 to 2021, Asian students had the smallest average decrease at 5.8%, whereas Native Hawaiian students had the largest average decrease, 11.5%. In spring 2022, average assessment scores increased for all racial and ethnic groups, but none have recovered to their pre-pandemic averages. In English, pre-existing disparities also exist prior to the pandemic. Again, average assessment scores declined for all racial and ethnic groups. From 2019 to 2021, Asian students had the smallest average decrease at 1.1%, and Native Hawaiian students had the largest decrease in English scores at 5.1%. Again, average assessment scores remained down from spring 2019, and as a result of this, racial disparities in assessment scores have increased. We also conducted a detailed statistical analysis to estimate how assessment scores varied in relation to other characteristics like school poverty level, students' eligibility for free and reduced price lunch, which is an indicator of student poverty level, and the proportion of the year that a student was offered in-person instruction. On the spring 2019 assessment, students at schools of the highest poverty level scored on average 13 to 15% lower than students at schools of the lowest poverty level. This association increased in fall 2021 and spring 2022 to 17 to 22% less. Across all three assessments, students that were eligible for free and reduced price lunch scored 10 to 12% lower than students that were not eligible for free and reduced price lunch. We found that students at schools that were in person the entire school year did not do better or worse on the English assessment than students at schools that were never in person. However, we did find that fully in-person students scored 3% better on the math assessment.
Next, we'll discuss how other equity indicators have changed since the start of the pandemic. JLARC staff evaluated racial disparities in student substance use, mental health, and access to experienced teachers. We also conducted a pandemic-related survey on teaching challenges. So to assess changes to student mental health and substance use, staff analyzed students' responses to the 2018 and 2021 Washington State Healthy Youth Survey. This survey is conducted biannually by the Department of Health and other state agencies. And the percentage of students across all racial and ethnic groups reporting cigarette, alcohol, and marijuana use in the last 30 days declined by 58%, 45%, and 47% respectively. Black and African American students reported the largest decrease in cigarette use. This was a 47% decrease. Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander students reported the largest decrease in alcohol use. This was a 62% decrease. And Hispanic and Latino students reported the largest decrease in marijuana use, a 63% decrease. Reported mental health problems also increased for all students. JLARC staff found that the percentage of students who reported feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge in the last 2 weeks increased from about 64% in 2018 to about 68% in 2021. Similarly, students who reported generalized anxiety disorder also increased from 31% in 2018 to almost 39% by 2021. Students of all racial and ethnic groups reported increases in anxiety, with students identifying as either white or 2 or more races reporting the highest rates of anxiety in both the 2018 and 2021 Healthy Youth surveys. Next, we'll pivot to teacher experience. Using data provided by OSPI, JLARC staff compared the average percentage of experienced teachers for students by race and ethnicity. And OSPI defines an experienced teacher as one who has 5 or more years of teaching experience. And so using this definition, staff found that access to experienced teachers increased from 2019 to 2021, reducing racial disparities. Statewide, the percentage of experienced teachers increased from 75% in the 2018-2019 school year to 80% in the 2020-2021 year. In the 2018-2019 school year, 77% of teachers for white students had 5 or more years of experience, and in that same year, between 68% and 75% of teachers for students of color had 5 or more years. This increased in 2021, where 81% of teachers for white students and between 75 and 79% of teachers for students of color had 5 or more years of experience. JLARC staff also worked with the Social Development Research Group at the University of Washington to conduct a survey of Washington teachers about the effects of the pandemic. We received responses from about 6,700 teachers from 1,475 schools in 228 districts. Respondents noted many different challenges during the 2020-21 school year, including covering less than their normal amount of curriculum. Higher percentages of in-person instruction were associated with more curriculum coverage. Additional serious problems described by teachers included students missing class, students not completing homework, low class participation, and student apathy. Teachers at schools with lower percentages of white students were more likely to report these problems as serious ones. Additional information and summaries of the teachers' responses can be found in Appendix B of our report.
All right, lastly, we will discuss OSPI's recovery monitoring. So as we've described, there were racial disparities in student access to in-person instruction, assessment scores declined, and student mental health problems increased. To address the effects of the pandemic, OSPI received $2.9 billion in federal elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds. Under federal law, 90% of these funds must be passed on to school districts. The funds can be used for a wide variety of activities, including sanitation and other materials necessary to reopen schools safely. But at least $334 million of the funds must be used to address learning loss and promote learning recovery. And learning loss is defined as the academic impact of lost instructional time due to school closures. These funds must also address the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on certain student groups, such as students from historically disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups. To receive the full amount of recovery funds, districts were required by state and federal law to submit academic and student well-being recovery plans to OSPI in 2021. The plans explain how districts intend to use emergency funding to address student needs resulting from school building closures and remote learning. Districts identified many specific interventions, including social, emotional learning and mental health supports, summer school, additional instructional time, and high-quality tutoring. The plans must explain how these interventions will assist students who were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, such as students from certain racial and ethnic groups. Districts submitted their plans in 2021. They're currently presumably implementing their plans, conducting after-school programs and tutoring programs and so on. OSPI committed to assisting districts with performance measurement and outcome monitoring in its state plan for the use of its funds, which it submitted to the United States Department of Education. And information on the effectiveness of interventions could then be used to target the remaining recovery funds. At the conclusion of our review, districts still had about $1.4 billion to spend. For example, if tutoring were shown to be the most effective intervention, schools could allocate additional funds to tutoring. The 2021 legislature directed schools to report their progress implementing their plans to OSPI. As of October 2022, OSPI had not yet identified a way for schools or school districts to report their progress or established a process to measure or monitor the outcomes of ESSER spending. It is unknown if districts have implemented the interventions in their plans or what effects those interventions may have had. Without monitoring districts' progress or measuring spending outcomes, there's limited information available about whether districts are achieving their learning recovery goals or whether interventions are helping students who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. It is also unclear how much districts are spending on the interventions. As of September 2022, districts had spent about $1.2 billion of their ESSER funding, which is 45% of the amount that they received. OSPI tracks the spending using broad categories. These categories are consistent with state and federal requirements. However, the categories do not provide sufficient detail to identify the amount spent on specific educational interventions. For the learning recovery funding, for example, 74% of the funds are reported in other categories. This means it is not possible to determine how much districts have spent on the interventions identified in their plans, such as tutoring, additional instructional time, or social emotional learning. And this brings us to the second legislative auditor recommendation. OSPI should establish a process to monitor school districts' implementation of their academic and student well-being recovery plans in accordance with 2021 state legislation. So to summarize some high-level points about racial equity, students' access to in-person instruction was not uniform across racial and ethnic groups. Return to in-person instruction varied by race and ethnicity. Assessment scores decreased for students from all racial and ethnic groups, with larger decreases for some groups. Declines were not necessarily linked to remote or hybrid learning, except with a small association for math scores. OSPI and districts have received $2.9 billion in federal funds to address pandemic effects, and some of these funds must be used to address the academic impacts of school closures, including racially disparate impacts. And OSPI has not yet established a process to monitor recovery plan implementation, which the legislature again requested in 2021. That concludes our preliminary presentation. We will present the proposed final report in May. The full report is available online, as well as an interactive data dashboard where you can look at school district assessment scores, and the summary of teacher survey information is available in an appendix to the report as well. Our information is available on the screen, and we're happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Not surprisingly, we have questions, and I'll be calling on Senators Wagner, Short, and Wilson, and then whoever else. Representative Berg, I'll intersperse you in there after Senator Wagner. Okay. Let's start with Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few, but I see lots, so maybe I'll just do a couple. Could we go back to, I think it was slide 10 that showed, I'm sorry, it's not slide 10. It showed a disparity between groups who were offered in person or not. And it showed a very low number for Asians returning. Yes. So do we have an insight as to why that happened? And then it's kind of strange to me because Asians started off better and declined less, yet they were not offered return to in-person instruction. It's very strange. If you could kind of develop that thought for me.
We explored two different breakdowns as well to how in-person instruction may have varied across the state. Schools that were east of the Cascades were more likely to be in person than schools west of the Cascades. And we found that schools in cities and suburban areas were more likely to remain hybrid than schools in rural or town areas.
And the Asian students in the sample were disproportionately located in city and suburban school districts and in the western side of the Cascades.
I see. And Mr. Chair, can I add an observation?
And I'm a little concerned about our terminology here, and just would urge people to be discussing Asian American students, right? Thank you. Yes, please follow up, Senator.
So further in your brief, you talked about the definition of experienced teacher, and I just, for me, experienced versus effective or good, I mean, I've been in the legislature 5 years, but it doesn't mean I'm a good or effective legislator. It just means I've been here for a while. So I'm wondering if there isn't a better measure of how good a teacher is and what our kids are getting.
Yeah, so OSPI collects data about students' equitable access to quality educators, and this is a federal requirement, and they have 3 measures that they use to identify a quality educator, and one of those is a teacher's years of experience. There's also a teacher's credentialing and whether or not a teacher is teaching in their field of expertise. And the data about teachers' certification and teachers teaching in their field of endorsement was different during the pandemic, essentially due to delays in issuing credentials and certifications. And so because of that, it was not possible for us to identify changes in those measures of teacher quality. So the measure that we had available from OSPI was a teacher's years of experience.
Thank you.
Representative Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this presentation. My questions are kind of more around the, I guess, lack of detail or the lack of ability to kind of track where and if the money being spent is effective. And I guess it's concerning because I remember being, it's slide 27 that I'm sort of referring to. I remember being in the conversations, having the planning, going through the thick documents that were required to utilize the money, reopening schools, et cetera. But it sounds like there's a disconnect at this point in terms of actually monitoring and figuring out if it's implemented and if it's working. And I guess, from your perspective, can you explain that disconnect, or is that more of an OSPI question?
Well, I can explain the first part of it, but OSPI might be able to answer in more detail. But districts did provide their recovery plans, and they submitted them, and many of them are indeed very lengthy documents. And there's the request from the legislature to report on the implementation of those plans, and that's the part that so far OSPI has not yet established a process for plan implementation. The districts themselves may have their own data about what their plan implementation is, but at the state level, at OSPI's level, there's no data yet available.
Mr. Chair, just a quick follow-up.
Certainly.
So those plans, and again, this might not be a question for you. Do we know if those plans were read or just warehoused? And the reason why I'm asking that, not to be flippant, it's just they were very lengthy, they were very detailed, and they were very disconnected. You could go district to district. You could draw a circle and hit 5 districts, and you could see that they filled out those documents in 5 different ways. And parents saw that, teachers saw that, frankly, board members saw that. And once you start realizing it, it became obvious that there would be some issues with monitoring. So when those plans were given, do we actually know who read them and what was done with those plans?
Yeah, I think that would be a better question for OSPI.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll ask OSPI to come up after we have questions from staff. And I just want to make sure, Representative Berg, you referred to your experience, and we should make note for the record that which school board you are a member of.
Mr. Chair, I am a recovering school board director. I am no longer a member of any school board, but I was a previous member of both Edmonds and Everett. Thank you.
And Senator Short.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And my questions too might be better answered by OSPI, but I'll start first with JLARC. The slide where you talked about the challenges that teachers were having with just with students in their classrooms, and I'm just wondering, because I represent rural small schools. They all said the same kind of thing, that they had significant problems, just like those that you've described here. But yet, I'll just share that the majority of our populations in our districts are Caucasian, but they were challenged the same way. So I'm wondering, how OSPI, if OSPI talk to you about how they reach that, because I think my schools are having the same kind of challenges, teachers have been sharing with me.
Yes, thank you. So this data is based on the JLARC staff survey that we conducted in accordance with the University of Washington's Social Development Research Group. And so this data was acquired by us, and we analyzed it according to student race and ethnicity information and student remote learning information. And some of these issues were common across the board, regardless of a student's race and or a school's racial composition or a school's remote learning status. And the information on the particular percentages is either in the report on tab 2, I believe, or in Appendix B that has more detail about the survey answers. But for example, students missing class at the schools that had the lowest percentage of white students, 72% of teachers reported that was a serious problem. And at schools that had the highest percentage of white students, 57% of teachers still reported that this was a serious problem. So even at schools with very high percentage of white students, this was still a major problem.
Okay, I really appreciate. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we had several different problems that that teachers identified, and some of those have some racial disparities in response, and some of them don't. But that information should be available in the appendix. And if you have further questions, we're happy to provide that information.
No, I really appreciate that feedback. That makes complete sense, because I know I've been hearing the same thing from our teachers. Second question, Mr. Chair, is just from JLARC's perspective, has OSPI determined when they're going to actually report, on the, the established process to monitor? Like, have you had interaction with them on, because that's a pretty big deal to look at learning loss, to make sure that the money was spent by, how it was spent by school districts in this process. Have they engaged with you at all on that?
Yes, we've spoken with several members of OSPI about this, but I think that they would be better able to answer their timelines and their plans.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
So, and I will, when OSPI comes up, I'll ask you to repeat your question for them. They're nodding in the audience, so they're keeping track of the questions. And okay, Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so mine is going to go back to budgeting item here. So $2.9 billion of ESSER funds, right? Roughly a half of that has been spent, but only 334 million of it was supposed to go to learning loss. Were you able to determine what portion of the learning loss money has been spent and what is remaining?
Yes, although I'm not sure if we have that number on us at the moment, but we can provide that information to you.
Okay, that's great. And then I have a follow-up with, well, actually, it will be an OSPI question. Well, actually, Representative Short actually asked that, the one that I was mostly concerned about. So I guess I'm very concerned that we don't know how this money has been spent on the intervention. So 1.2 billion. It's impossible to detect what they've spent, is what I heard. And so I'll be curious to talk to OSPI. Thank you.
Let me ask just a follow-up, and then OSPI can follow up as well. My understanding is that we have detailed reporting on every dollar that the districts spend. Could you explain that? And it may not be in reports yet. So could you explain how that works?
Yes. Yeah, there's detailed reporting about the money that is spent, and there's 2 reporting systems about the ESSER funding. And some of the reporting is accounting by object and activity. There's information about how much money is going to salaries or how much money is going to teaching and things like that. And then in the other system, there's information about certain categories that are unique to ESSER spending. So how much money is being spent on, say, sanitation or HVAC systems to try to prevent the spread of infectious diseases and so on. There is not information, though, about the interventions the districts are intending to implement. So how much money is being spent on, for example, tutoring or on summer school programs or something like that. So there is detailed accounting, but it is different from the interventions themselves.
So we can, I know we're going to have some questions for OSPI about tracking the interventions based on evidence-based practices that reduce the disparities and learning loss, right? So just be prepared for when you come up. And Representative Orcutt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 228 school districts you had responses from. I know there were 295 school districts. Of the school districts that didn't respond, were they primarily rural, small, or was it across the board? And then the other thing I want to ask about is, I don't know how many schools there are in those 295 school districts, but I do know that you could have a situation where maybe Cowieman or say Wallace Elementary and the Kelso School District reports, but and that's in the city of Kelso. But also within the Kelso School District, you've got Rose Valley and Carroll schools that are very much rural. Do we know in those 1,475 what the distribution was, whether they were in a more urban type of setting or a rural type of setting?
Yes, for most of the responses, we have that information, and there were some responses that we were not able to link to a school or a school district. In the appendix of the report, we broke it out by educational service district to try to provide some sense of what the geography was of the responses. And the district with the highest percentage, the highest response rate, or the educational service district with the highest response rate was ESD 114, the Olympic ESD. And then the district, or the
Puget Sound ESD,
sorry. Yeah, and the highest number of responses came from Puget Sound ESD. And then the ESD with the lowest number of responses, I believe, was ESD 105, that incorporates Kittitas, Yakima, and parts of Grant and Klickitat counties.
Keenan.
And just so I could clarify for your context for you, Representative Orcutt, and the information that we're referring to on the slide here only related to the survey of staff. The other parts of the analysis in the study that related to student assessment scores and the health status of students, that was a universal 100% sample. So,
can I? And I don't know if you've got this, but you found an association between in-person instruction and the percentage of curriculum that was completed via this, in terms of the survey. Because that's the survey of teachers, is there any way of seeing if there's an association in terms of that and learning loss, or in terms of percent
did not attempt to put that into our statistical model of the assessment scores. We did do this to try to provide some sense around what the assessment scores were saying and how we might better interpret them. The curriculum coverage, we should also note that that teachers at schools that were remote for a long time reported lower curriculum coverage, as well as teachers at schools that were in person for the majority of the year. There was a difference there, but it was across the board that the teachers reported lower curriculum coverage during the school year.
But there isn't a clear association that you found between in-person time and curriculum coverage. But, okay. Are there any other questions for JLARC staff before we ask OSPI to come up? Okay. All right, thank you very much. I just want to thank you for this. This is a huge, huge policy issue that required a great deal of work in terms of statistical evaluation, surveys, research in terms of practices and evidence. So I really want to thank the JLARC staff for an extraordinary public service here on behalf of our youth, and who we have to make a lot of decisions about learning recovery, mental health, sports, and all the social emotional learning, et cetera. Thank you. Welcome to our Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, OSPI team. Would you introduce yourselves, and you want to just give a little overview in response to any of the questions you heard before we return to questions?
Sure. Hi, I'm Deb Kame. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Assessment and Student Information at OSPI.
And I'm Maria Flores. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for the Improvement of Student Learning at OSPI. And you wanted a quick overview response? Well, one thing, we have 4 points that we'd like to respond to. So quickly, I'll list them, and then we can go into more detail. One is that the data on instructional mode has been misinterpreted, and we'd like that clarified. We provided some substantive technical response to the preliminary report on this. Also, the the conclusions made about the race and ethnicity data and when those data are to be collected is also needs to be corrected. We have also included the timing of the federal and state requirements and when our guidance and monitoring timelines came through that we'd like to clarify. And then additionally, the concept of monitoring. So we do have substantial monitoring of all of the funding, and we have monitoring in place to Representative Berg's of both the plan and then some of the initial implementation. So we provided these technical review documents to JLARC staff and have not received a response, but we wanted to let you know that we have a lot to share.
I think it would probably behoove us to have you explain a little bit further, because it seems like, in terms of the first 2 items you said need correction on instructional mode, and, that seems pretty straightforward in terms of which districts move to hybrid or in-person at what time, and am I missing something on this?
Yeah, I can address that somewhat. With the data that were available in the way that we collected it from districts was done broadly and not at the student level. If you can recall, the 2021 school year was, there was a lot going on, and so gathering that information from districts was challenging, and it was also evolving from day to day from the districts. But collecting the information, if a districts, particularly at the start of the 2021 school year, many districts were bringing some students in person for perhaps 1 day a week or 2 days a week, but it was targeted at particular student groups. So to draw a conclusion about a school or a district being hybrid, it may have been only 5% of the students that were coming in or that were actually offered hybrid. It wasn't until somewhat later in the school year when that was available for students to be in hybrid. So there are a lot of nuances with that data, and we'd like to continue to work with staff to make sure that that's clearly articulated in the report.
So that isn't then a problem with the data collection from the point of view of the JLARC staff, but rather how discombobulated reporting was to OSPI and what was called in-person or hybrid, essentially.
Well, I think it may have been misinterpreted, in particular looking at, for example, the data that were reported about number of students who were offered hybrid at the start of that school year. And so I think it's really clarifying it. It is nuanced, but I think the data may have been misinterpreted.
And would that also then apply to the UW Research Program survey of the teachers? Because presumably they knew whether or not they were in person or hybrid or remote when they were responding to the survey.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the responses and the specific questions that were articulated in that survey.
Thank you. Do you want to present, or should I ask committee members to resume, come back on for their questions? Okay. Let's start with Senator Short.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just if you could talk about, your plans of making that data, and I need to go back to my notes. I flipped the page here. Sorry about that. So, just in terms of how you're monitoring, like, what is OSPI's intention there? I think that monitoring is huge. When we talk about learning loss and how dollars were spent and things like that. And in JLARC, their report essentially said you haven't established one yet. And so that's pretty disconcerting. We're all the way through 2022, but I'm wondering if you can share what OSPI's plans are.
Certainly. So a couple of things, and this is in the detailed timeline that we provided to staff. We have fiscal monitoring, as JLARC staff mentioned, and it is broken down into accounting codes. And I want to peel that apart a little bit so we can both monitor the use of funds. I also want to remind that the remaining funds that districts have not expended, they're allowed to hold on to until the end of ESSER or ARP, ESSER 3. So we have 3 different timelines of federal funding that was released. So some of those are part of their reopening plans and were intentionally planned for later in the year. We have it by accounting code. We also have on our website monitoring by the interventions that the districts submitted in their reopening plan. Where it gets tricky, and we can do this analysis, is that one of the interventions that many districts chose was called multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS. And that's not a thing you buy. You don't just buy it off the shelf. To implement MTSS, which is a tiered support model for students, you are investing in staff salaries, you are investing in time, instructional time, you're investing in professional learning time. Those are all activity and duty codes in the accounting system. So if I wanted to pull out how much did they spend on MTSS, it is a little more complicated to associate all of the reported salaries to that instructional model. So I want to clarify that, but we do have all of the interventions and also all of the money that they have expended to date in all of the generally accepted accounting codes. But when we look at the staff mentioned tutoring, for example, too, there are ways that you could also pull apart tutoring. So some of that was additional instructional time, which we would be able to see in some of their accounting. But some tutoring happened within the day. So you would not be able to pull apart, was this teacher's time fully, their full FTE on instruction in a normal school day, or did they have, a 0.8 and then a 0.2 that was directed to tutoring? So to clarify, we have all of the accounting by the accounting codes. We have information on what intervention and evidence-based models they put into place. And to do the level of analysis, we would need to go a little deeper and into how they broke up things like time and staffing, to bucket it into those types of interventions, if that makes sense. Does that help, Senator Short?
It does, but definitely keep us posted. We know that this is going to take some time, but yes, I appreciate your explanation.
Yes, and we can provide you the link to the publicly available dashboards that we have on our website.
That'd be great.
And I think, Director Flores, would it be accurate to say that multi-tiered system of support is something the legislature has actually mandated for kindergarten through second grade for assessment of reading on dyslexia and phonetic obstacles, et cetera, right?
Yes, it's part of the screening criteria for dyslexia. It was also, I think, important to mention that in our reopening guidance, we required that there were universal screeners and diagnostic tools that districts identified, and we required that they identify and use a racial equity tool to look at their data and identify where existing disparities were at the local level to then address their specific interventions in their plans.
Do we have some other follow-up questions from committee members? Representative Berg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the clarifications. I think for me, I guess where my brain is that there seems like there's a disconnect, right, between the audit and between what OSPI is doing and seeing in the dashboards. And I think as a policymaker, it's difficult because we're in a situation where, especially when you're talking about the multi-tiered systems of support, for example, those are people-driven. Those are salaries. Those are things that, frankly, I think a lot of districts are going to want to continue. Yeah. And when you look at the timing of the ESSER funds and when they have to be spent, our legislative session, and frankly, just the movement of money and how we have to do our staffing, and I say we, like the collective we as a state, that also being our school districts, there's some deadlines that are coming up. And so how do we get it connected, right? How do we figure out what's working, how we monitoring it, what's been implemented, and what should continue? Because right now I'm looking at this and I don't see, not that I don't see answers, I don't even see a path for answers. And what's going to happen is folks are going to come to us and say, look, we need to continue X. And we're going to say, we have an audit that says we don't know what X is. And then OSPI is going to say, wait, go out to a dashboard and look, we think we know what X is. So how do we get that together so that we can make the best legislation that we can for our kiddos?
That's a really good question. Well, a couple of things. I think that some of the membership associations have already organized their members, including the School Board Directors Association, and been able to lift what was in their reopening plans. And some of those things you were probably already well aware of, like the prototypical schools investment in social workers, family engagement coordinators, all of those supportive staff. Those were in almost every single plan that they were going to invest in some of those staff types. Those would be reported in the accounting codes. But the individual boards and districts know, we used ESSER funds and we have 10 family engagement coordinators that we funded out of federal money. It's a state obligation, or it's a state prototypical staff type, and we haven't funded it. I think the membership associations are pretty poised to be able to answer those things. I think OSPI can do some work in trying to lift those patterns. I think we have in our decision packages to say this is what we're hearing and these are the things that are going away with ESSER money that need to be maintained. And then I think the last bit was in the reopening plan. I just wanted to circle back to what you said at the beginning. All of those reopening plans were read by OSPI leadership and approved. And some districts, we did need to follow up with them for completeness, for them to explain more what they were planning to do. But every plan was read and approved. They weren't binders on a shelf. So we were very intentional in knowing what are they doing, how are they going to spend their money, and then we've been providing technical assistance on the use of those funds. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we can answer in collaboration with the membership associations and OSPI, lifting additional themes that we can pull from what we've heard from districts.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to follow up, because you hit the nail on the head, right? When you said that you've got, for example, 10 family engagement specialists, that's a head count that's real. It's used with one-time ESSER funding. I'm saying one-time in air quotes. And that functionally redistributed or made, I think, better the prototypical school funding model. But that making it better, the funding for that was not long-term funding. So that additional support, that additional head count. So the question is going to become, do we continue it? And so is there a way, from the auditor's perspective, is there a way to connect? Will we have the data that we need by the time we have to make the decision of, do we continue to support these implementations, right? These things that are, I think, helping our students. I know they're helping our students, but how do we figure out that they really are and that we can continue to invest in them as a state? And how do we get our audit agency the information that OSPI has so that it's all complete?
I think we can, and I chose that example because it was easy, because we do have those FTE reported to us. I think FTE will be the easiest, time will be the easiest. Using MTSS, again, that's going to be more complicated to lift that as a model and then at a district level say, it was this much funding, it was staff time, this configuration of services. But we can, I think that OSPI can respond with data on FTE and time.
And last question, Senator Wilson.
Thank you. This is a different question than I asked earlier because the other one was answered, but I'm listening to all this and I'm rather concerned. I don't know that I see the urgency in to remedy the learning loss that our kids have experienced over the last few years. In fact, our state assessments show that only 1 in 3 children are at grade level right now in both English and math. And we, at one point, were ranking in the top 10 in the country in student performance. But since 2013, our relative performance has declined every cycle since. And so I heard that the funding could be used, they could hang on, they're allowed to hang on to some of this. It's like, but why are they hanging on to it? Why are we not directing this more to this learning loss? We know that over the course of years of research tells us that if the learning loss that the kids that have lost are going to affect them in their adulthood and their economic abilities to earn funding or money. And I'm just really concerned that we don't have a laser focus on this learning loss. I mean, the fact that report was due in 2021 and we're well over a year into when we were supposed to have that done. So I have real concerns about this. And so I really hope that OSPI will quickly dig deep into what we need to be doing for these kids in this learning loss.
Thank you, Senator Wilson. And I will push back gently to say I don't think there's anyone feeling more sense of urgency than OSPI in every school district in the state. The data that's included, if you remember the timeline of when we had to postpone the assessments, the state level assessments, that's the data that we receive at the state level. Districts perform formative assessments. These are those interim real-time assessments where they are monitoring the gap and remedying the gap, and that data is not reported to the state. But in our work with districts, they are very laser focused on knowing exactly where their students are and what it will take to get them to proficiency. I think that in this next testing cycle, and Assistant Superintendent Deb Kame could talk about this, we will be identifying schools for improvement status, but we will also be able to have a more stable, I guess, series of score reports to see the trajectory of learning loss. But I think what I'm trying to say is that at the district level, they are monitoring very closely with formative assessments. Those data are not reported to the state. Only the state-based assessments are.
I'm very concerned that we have to wrap up here, and I want to close with a request that OSPI meet again with the JLARC staff. If there is monitoring performance plan, plans for monitoring performance and more detailed reporting other than based on outcomes and not just on expenditure, then it's important that you share that for the final report. And so I just want to encourage that to happen, and we have to wrap up here. Thank you very much for coming, and I am sure you're available for further discussion with members. Thank you. With that, we need to move quickly to the fifth item, the leasing of state highway right-of-way to Sound Transit. This is a proposed final report, so we need to have a vote on it, and we still need time for the annual report of the legislative auditor.
Chair, would you like me to?
Please proceed.
Right. Good morning, Chair Paulette, members of the committee. My name is Zach Freeman, staff to JLARC, and I'm presenting our proposed final report on leasing state highway right-of-way to Sound Transit. The legislative auditor concludes that Sound Transit leases portions of state highway property. Leases portions of state highway property from WashDOT to build its Link Light Rail system. Sound Transit currently pays market value for the leases, but a proposed new land bank agreement may reduce its costs by 57% through 2060. Both agencies would benefit from increased oversight of the agreement. A proviso in the 2021 state transportation budget directed JLARC staff to review a land bank agreement between WashDOT and Sound Transit. Sound Transit is a regional transit authority serving King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties, and it leases portions of state highway property from WashDOT to build its light rail system. The proviso also directed us to consider the cost to the state if lease rates are discounted by the federal share of funds that were used to acquire or improve the property originally. And historically, this has been between 80 and 90% of those costs. State and federal law allow WashDOT to lease unused right-of-way for non-highway purposes. And here, right-of-way refers to the property used for construction or operation or maintenance of a transportation facility. And Sound Transit typically uses unimproved areas on the shoulders of state highways, as shown here on I-5 near Shoreline. JLARC staff hired independent appraisers with experience in appraising public rights-of-way, and the consultants reviewed 5 appraisal reports and found that the methods and assumptions met industry standards and that lease rates were set at market value. WashDOT and Sound Transit signed an interagency land bank agreement in 2000. The agreement creates a ledger to record in-kind transactions between the two agencies. And on the debit side of the ledger, Sound Transit leases highway right-of-way from WashDOT, again, for its light rail system. And it offsets those lease costs with credits earned from funding transit improvements benefiting the state transportation system. And to date, Sound Transit has offset all lease costs with credits earned from those improvements. If Sound Transit does not have enough credits, it would have to pay cash under the terms of the agreement. In addition to creating a ledger to record in-kind transactions, the land bank agreement also establishes a template for leasing highway right-of-way to Sound Transit. The template includes leases of up to 40 years consisting of an initial 20-year term with the option to extend for an additional 20 years. Lease rates are set at market value with the first 20 years paid in advance by Sound Transit. And WashDOT has the ability to adjust lease rates every 5 years after the end of the initial 20-year term. The land bank agreement also allows Sound Transit to earn credit for certain transit improvements. To be eligible for credit, a project must benefit the highway and system in one of two ways: by increasing vehicle mobility. This has occurred by when Sound Transit has funded new HOV or transit lanes that expand highway capacity, or improve traffic safety. So for example, Sound Transit has built direct access ramps that allowed transit vehicles to enter and exit the freeway without weaving across multiple lanes of traffic. In 2015, WashDOT created the Land Bank Oversight Committee to review requests for land bank credit. One of the committee's responsibilities is to determine whether a project is eligible with the agreement. The Sound Transit initiates the review process by submitting a request for eligibility to WashDOT. WashDOT traffic engineers review the project's design and other documentation to determine whether it provides a highway benefit. WashDOT management then reviews the analysis from the traffic engineers and issues a recommendation to the Land Bank Oversight Committee, which then votes to place the project on one of the approved lists for credit. Sound Transit has earned $602 million in credits to offset its lease costs since the agreement was founded in 2000. Here, some of those projects are shown, and they include projects on Interstates 5, 90, 405, and other state highways. These projects are primarily bus system improvements that also have a benefit to traffic mobility or safety. Sound Transit conducts an annual forecast of the land bank balance as part of its federally mandated long-range financial plan. And that forecast includes current and future leases, which are the debits in the ledger, planned highway improvements, are the credits, and economic indicators such as right-of-way inflation or discount rates. So here, this graph shows the forecast of the land bank balance from 2022 to 2028. As you can see on the left, Sound Transit currently has a balance of 123 million credits. However, it is forecasted to fall, to dip below, to fall to negative numbers in 2024 to 2026. As the terms of the agreement do prohibit a negative balance, this would require Sound Transit to pay cash for those leases if they didn't have insufficient credits. So in 2024, if that does occur, it would be the first time that Sound Transit has had to pay cash for its leases under the agreement. And as you can see, the balance does return to a surplus in 2027 following the completion of Sound Transit's BRT project on I-405. The agencies have developed new procedures since Land Bank was last updated in 2003, and as a result, the Land Bank agreement no longer reflects current practice. Some of the new procedures include new lease types, such as temporary construction leases, new administrative procedures, and the creation of the Land Bank Oversight Committee and some of the procedures that it has created that are outside of the terms of the agreement. We found that staff from WashDOT and Sound Transit work together on land bank projects, but that there is no formal interagency process or structure to administer the agreement. For example, the Oversight Committee includes staff only from WashDOT, while the land bank forecast is prepared exclusively by staff from Sound Transit. And we found Sound Transit does not have its own internal committees or procedures similar to the Land Bank Oversight Committee that WashDOT established. And we found that increasing formal coordination would increase administrative efficiency and maintain continuity should key staff leave either agency. And as a result, the legislative auditor recommends that WashDOT and Sound Transit should strengthen internal oversight of the land bank agreement and develop written procedures to jointly administer the agreement. And both agencies have concurred, and OFM had no comment. So I can stop there if you'd like to save time. Or...
Thank you. We do need to save some time, and thank you for presenting the final report. We have available online 3 representatives from Sound Transit and someone from the Director of Regional Transit for WashDOT. Do they have any comments that you'd wish to make before we act?
Mr. Chair, Alex Soldano, Director of State Relations at Sound Transit. I just want to direct anyone who might be interested in the formal response from Sound Transit to refer to those materials. And outside of that, in the interest of time, I will refer any comment to that formal response.
Thank you, Alex. Any questions from the committee for either staff or Alex? Okay. In that case, Representative Orcutt, would you make a motion to adopt the report?
So moved.
It has been moved. Do I have a second? Senator Rivers has seconded. Is there discussion before adoption? Does anyone have anything they'd like to say? Senator Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We heard a preliminary discussion on this same report earlier that talked about changing the way that the rent of the land was computed. Is any of that in what we're about to vote upon, or just the idea that they need to do better coordination?
Maybe I could help clarify, Senator, two issues there, I think. First of all, just a reminder for the full committee that your action here is not taking a position on the underlying policies. It's the action to distribute the report and say the audit process is completed. So you're not in a position where you're having to say you're agreeing or disagreeing with the underlying policy of how rents are set. And actually, I'm not sure what my second point is. I think that was my only point, just that to clarify. That's really what you're voting on, and you're not having to vote on the recommendation.
But Zach, do you want to clarify if the report includes the discussion about the market basis or use of the federal subsidy instead to reduce the rent?
Yeah, so there is more information on the proposed new land bank agreement, which would have come later in the presentation. We just kind of show what the potential impact of implementing that agreement would be. We are not staking a position on it. I know the agencies could provide more information, but they are working on that between themselves.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Any other questions? All right. So we have or I should say, any other comments at this point? We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say your name and aye if you're online. Others just say aye. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Short votes aye.
Loveland, aye.
Wagner votes aye.
Are there any opposed to adoption of the report and distribution of the report? Not hearing any opposed. Is anyone abstaining from voting? Okay. By your action, the report is adopted for distribution, and per our practice, it will be going to the relevant committees of the legislature, which include those of you who sit on transportation and probably some other committees as well. With that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to our legislative auditor, and as well as invite our incoming legislative auditor to the front table. Welcome to Eric Thomas, our incoming legislative auditor. It is an honor to have worked with you and know that we're in good hands as we transition. And would you like to kick off some notes of appreciation here?
Sure. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Eric Thomas, JLARC staff. Keenan, the members are going to introduce a resolution that will speak to some of your specific accomplishments as your tenure as legislative auditor, but just speaking from a staff perspective, you have been a tremendous leader and mentor and leave very big shoes to fill. And I think one of the things that really stands out is that you've recruited, trained, and led 26 people who approach this work through the lens of, is that how Keenan would do it? Is that what Keenan would do? Which I think bodes well for this office continuing to do good work for the legislature. So on behalf of everyone on JLARC staff, thank you and congratulations.
As Eric said, Representative Orcutt and I will be introducing a resolution, and I believe there will also be a Senate resolution. And I'd like to note that Keenan, you've served the public in the state of Washington for 3 decades, and there have been 8 different chairs of this committee while you've been legislative auditor and built a national reputation. I just want to say that as the current chair, none of the success is due to the chair, at least the current chair of this committee. It is an honor to have worked with you, and every meeting to learn about how we can improve and better the performance of agencies from local governments and special purpose districts up to the largest state agencies, and I do think that many legislators have asked the same question that Eric just said, which is, what would Keenan ask as we look at carrying out our oversight duties and improvement of state agencies? And so with that, I just want to say thank you so much, and we will formally thank you and hope that you'll be present when we do so. Representative Orcutt and Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to express my appreciation for Keenan and all the work that he's done. You know, one of the we heard from staff is, you know, what would Keenan do? But remember who hired the staff. And every time there's been a vacancy, Keenan's had to work to try and find somebody who was qualified, who would be as committed, and that he could train to perform the tasks that we all depend on. And during that whole process, he has found those quality individuals, and it shows in the number of national awards we've gotten. I know several years ago, Keenan called me up and said, "Hey, are you going to NCSL?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, we're getting an award there. Would you go and you know, get it for us?" And so I did. I attended the presentation at NCSL and accepted it on behalf of JLARC. And that's just one example of the awards that JLARC has gotten under Keenan's leadership. I do want to point out that, you know, he has continued to help JLARC evolve. One of the things that he's tried to do is to make sure that there's more visibility to the reports that come out. And he started to direct them to committee chairs and ranking members. So if something has to do with, you know, a state agency, send that to the chair and the ranking member of the state agency or the state government committee in both the House and the Senate. And some of these actually get to be, you know, about half the committees in the legislature that they're getting sent to. But that's something that Keenan did. with a racial equity analysis. That's something fairly new. And there have been other things that have come along that Keenan's had to try and figure out, work with his staff to try and figure out how they're going to implement and how they're going to meet the intent of the legislature. And then just working with individual legislators when we've had requests, concerns. You know, he's been very receptive to the questions that we've had, to the concerns that we've had, and made changes as a result of those. So I really appreciate how, you know, Keenan hasn't allowed things to stagnate. He's allowed them to develop. He's actually been proactive in evolving JLARC and still maintaining those professional audit standards as we do it, and figuring out how to maintain professional audit standards to apply it to something new. So it's a very important job. It's a very technical job. There are very strict guidelines that have to be followed, and I think he's done an excellent job. Of recruiting new staff, hiring new staff, and making sure that we've got key people helping support the work that he's trying to do and to get done for all of us in the legislature. So thank you, Keenan.
Senator Wilson as Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't take as long because so much of this has already been said about Keenan that I absolutely agree with. But it has been a pleasure to work with you for all the years that I've been on JLARC committee as well. I appreciate how straightforward you are. I also appreciate the fairness and I guess nonpartisan ways that you handle things. I think that JLARC is one of the few committees in the legislature that really strives to be that way, and you're a good reason why it continues to be. And then Representative Orcutt did mention the leadership role that you have been playing for all these years. It's not only just noticed by our state, but nationally with these awards. Many other states look to us, to Washington, to make sure that, or to get the great ideas that you have implemented. So I really appreciate everything you've done, and I really hope that you enjoy your retirement and your grandkids and your family the way you should. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. And I want to say that Chair Emeritus Senator Mullet wanted to pass on his really heartfelt appreciation from years of working in collaboration with you and echoing these same sentiments. Would you like to give your final annual report?
Sure, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much to all of you for the very generous and heartfelt comments. When you do work at a place this long and this closely, as I have with all of you, it is, you realize it is kind of a big deal. So, but my recap of the annual report is read the annual report. There's some great stuff in there. But I would like to leave with two comments. One of them is definitely an area that all of you reflected on already. I think, you know, when you have been doing this job as long as you have, as long as I have, right? And people ask you, what do you think your legacy is? And I truly hope that the thing that I feel proudest about is the JLARC staff. They are an amazing group of 27 individuals who are just off the charts in terms of their competence, their knowledge, their skills, their creativity, and their commitment to doing this work on your behalf to help improve state government for all of our citizens here. They are just fundamentally impossible to beat. And I couldn't be more proud to brag that I've hired them all. It's a pretty great accomplishment. And I also want to thank all the committee members, not only for the compliments to me, but the work you do here. It's a really great committee to be on. It was interesting to hear when I first started doing, when I became the deputy and started hearing more about, members coming on to the committee and how they come on. How many of them said, I came on the committee because I have been waiting for years and really wanted to be here because I'm interested in the work and I'm interested in the detail we get into that often you're unable to in some of the other committees. So it's a great testament to the work. You work together, as Senator Wilson said, on a bipartisan basis so well that it's really inspiring to staff. And you have a lot of courage. And what I mean by that is, I know probably all of you have sometimes read one of my reports, and there was something in there that maybe surprised you or wasn't exactly what you expected or thought might have been the information. But you've been really, really patient and courageous to allow us to do that work independently and to consider that and to reflect on it and use it to make government better. It is a great testament, and it's a real privilege to work with members like that. So thank you all so much. I am going to miss working here. People have told me don't watch TVW too much, and I promise I won't. And it's been a great ride, and I really look forward to handing the keys over to Eric and all the other staff. They're going to do a great job. Thank you very much.
Watch TVW lots, but also go visit Washington's best places instead of just watching them on TVW. With that, I will close our meeting with a reminder that we have a I-900 subcommittee meeting here, right, at 1:30, 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock, thank you. At 1 o'clock, we convene for the state auditor's presentation on performance audits. 1 o'clock, same room. Thank you all very much, and thank you very much, Keenan, for your years of service. Welcome to Eric.